An officer kicked Chuck Norris' daughter in the head right in the school hallway. He thought he would get away with it. But a few seconds later, her father entered the school, and what happened next shocked all the witnesses. The morning sunlight poured across the sprawling campus of Ridgeview High School, painting the red-bricked walls in a false glow of warmth. From a distance, the school looked like a place of opportunity, its front lawn neatly trimmed, banners on the poles fluttering with phrases like excellence, respect, and integrity. Parents liked to believe this was where their children would be safe, sheltered, and guided toward futures brighter than their own. The brochures promised it. The principal repeated it in assemblies. And for most who passed by on the main road, the place appeared to live up to its reputation. But inside those halls, where the sound of lockers slamming echoed like gunshots and laughter tangled with whispers, the truth was less polished. Here, authority did not always come from teachers or textbooks. It came from a man in a uniform whose shadow stretched longer than any hallway. Dakota Allen Norris walked through the front doors like any other student, her backpack slung casually over one shoulder, her long hair tied back the way her father preferred when she went to school. To most, she looked like a typical 17-year-old girl, tall, athletic, bright-eyed. But to those who studied her face, the resemblance was unmistakable. She had the same strong jawline, the same steady gaze, the same aura of self-control that belonged to her father, Chuck Norris. It was not something she flaunted. In fact, she spent most of her teenage years trying to escape the weight of that last name. Her father was a legend, a martial arts champion, a Hollywood icon, a man whose face was etched into American culture. But Dakota wanted to be known for her own merits, not just as someone's daughter. She worked harder than most. Straight A's in math and science, captain of the girls' soccer team, volunteer hours at a community center. Teachers admired her discipline, though some whispered she was distant. Classmates noticed her quiet confidence, but often mistook it for arrogance. She rarely corrected them. Her father had taught her early that silence was sometimes stronger than words. Yet behind that silence lived a girl who wanted nothing more than to be normal, to eat lunch without stares, to walk down a hallway without hearing. "Hey, isn't that Chuck Norris's kid?" Ridgeview, however, was not a place where anonymity came easily. The students noticed everything, and those in power noticed even more. That was especially true for Officer Raymond Doyle, the man hired as the school's security officer 2 years earlier. He was a broad man with a barrel chest, shaved head, and a mustache that did little to soften his features. His belt hung heavy with radio, taser, baton, and handcuffs, and he walked the corridors like he owned them. Some said he had come from the city police department. Others whispered he had left under a cloud of complaints. None of that mattered in Ridgeview. To the administration, he was a symbol of safety. To the students, he was a constant reminder of power and its misuse. Doyle had a way of filling the hall with unease. He never shouted unless he wanted to, but his stare alone could freeze a student mid-step. He prowled during passing periods, leaned against lockers during lunch, and lingered near the restrooms long enough to make kids nervous. Teachers tolerated him because he kept order. Parents tolerated him because they were told he was necessary. But the students knew. They felt the weight of his authority pressing down on them, especially those who looked different, spoke quietly, or stood out for reasons that made adults uncomfortable. Dakota had noticed him long before he noticed her. She saw the way he singled out certain boys in baggy hoodies, or followed the Latino kids in the lunch line a little too closely. She saw how he cornered shy freshmen with unnecessary questions, making them squirm until they almost admitted to things they had never done. She didn't like him, but she told herself to ignore him. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Pick your battles, know when to stand and when to step aside. But Doyle noticed Dakota sooner than she expected. Maybe it was her composure that drew his eye, or maybe it was the way she refused to shrink under his stare. In a building where most students lowered their gaze and hurried past, she kept her steady. One afternoon, he stopped her outside the gym, his voice casual but edged with something sharp. "Bag check," he said, gesturing with 2 fingers. She froze for a second, caught off guard, but then unzipped her backpack without a word. He rifled through her notebooks, soccer cleats, and lunch container. When he found nothing, he handed it back with a smirk that said he hadn't really been looking for anything at all. She walked away without reacting, but her stomach tightened. Over the following weeks, these random encounters became routine. He would appear near her locker just as she arrived, asking where she had been the last period. He would stop her in the courtyard, claiming to have seen her talking to kids he labeled as troublemakers. He even interrupted her walk to class one morning, demanding she show the contents of her pockets. Nothing ever came of it, yet each time the humiliation grew sharper, like a cut that wouldn't heal. Other students noticed. Some laughed quietly, others turned away. Dakota kept her face calm, but inside a storm brewed. It wasn't only Doyle who contributed to the atmosphere of silence. Teachers, too, had their blind spots. They saw the way he hovered near certain students, but they chose not to interfere. To them, he was a professional, an officer keeping order. To challenge him meant paperwork, meetings, controversy. So they looked away, just as they had looked away in other schools when complaints piled up but were never pursued. For Dakota, each day became a balancing act between her determination to succeed and her need to endure Doyle's scrutiny. She returned home each evening with a smile, unwilling to burden her father with stories she felt she could handle herself. Chuck Norris had raised her to be resilient, to withstand pressure without breaking. But the truth was, she was still young, still learning where the line between endurance and silence lay. At night, when she closed her eyes, she replayed those moments in the halls. His looming figure, his probing questions, his eyes scanning her as though she were guilty of something unseen. Yet despite the weight pressing down, Dakota continued to move forward. She sat in the front row during science lectures, hand raised to answer questions before others had even processed them. She trained with her soccer team after school, sweat soaking her jersey as she pushed herself harder than anyone else. She helped a freshman with homework in the library, smiling gently when the girl whispered, "You're not like I thought you'd be." In these moments, she felt free, separate from the shadow that trailed her steps. Still, that shadow grew. Doyle began to linger longer, to stand just close enough to remind her of his presence. His comments became more pointed. "Not so tough without your daddy around, huh?" he muttered one morning as she passed him by. She clenched her fists, kept walking, her face unreadable. But inside, anger simmered. She wanted to shout, to remind him that she was more than her father's name, more than a target for his frustrations. Yet she swallowed the words. The hallways of Ridgeview were alive with chatter, with posters about Spirit Week and college prep sessions. But beneath the noise lay a silence that told a different story, a silence that stretched every time Doyle stopped a student, every time a teacher looked away, every time Dakota pretended she didn't feel the eyes burning into her back. It was the kind of silence that grew heavier with each passing day, waiting for the moment it would break. And though she could not have known it then, the moment was drawing near. The corridors that had become her battlefield were about to transform into something far more dangerous. The officer's interest in her was no longer casual. It was a storm building on the horizon, and when it finally struck, it would leave more than bruises. It would leave a mark on the school, on the community, and on her family that could never be erased. The shadow that had crept into Dakota's days did not fade. It lengthened. What had begun as passing remarks and casual stops in the hall turned into something heavier, something deliberate, as if Officer Doyle had chosen her as the focus of his restless authority. After the encounter outside the gym, she tried to convince herself it was coincidence, that perhaps his eyes swept over everyone the same way, and she only imagined the weight of his stare. But each morning when she entered Ridgeview's corridors, her hope dissolved. He was always there, leaning against a locker at the far end, arms crossed over his chest, gaze already searching for her. At first she told herself she was strong enough to handle it. Her father had trained her to stay calm under pressure, to think before acting. He had taught her to master fear, not by denying it, but by refusing to let it control her. She remembered sparring sessions in the family's home gym, Chuck correcting her posture, reminding her that balance mattered more than brute strength. Those lessons had shaped her. But no amount of martial discipline prepared her for the slow drip of humiliation that came from being treated like a criminal in her own school. The encounters grew sharper. One morning when she hurried down the hall to make it to chemistry before the bell, Doyle blocked her way with an outstretched arm. "Late again?" he asked, though she was not late at all. "Where were you before this?" "In the library," she said evenly. "Show me," he demanded. "Pass, slip, something." "I don't need a pass for the library." His eyes narrowed. "So you just wander around?" "I was studying." He leaned closer, his breath heavy with coffee. "Empty your pockets." Students streamed around them, glancing sideways but never stopping. She pulled her hands from her pockets and showed the nothingness inside. He nodded slowly, as if her compliance still concealed guilt. "Go on," he said finally, stepping aside with the faintest curl of a smirk. That day, Dakota took her seat in chemistry, shoulders rigid, jaw tight. The other students whispered to one another, their eyes flicking back to her. One boy snickered under his breath. She ignored it, staring at her notes until the letters blurred. The following week, it was her locker. She was spinning the combination when Doyle appeared beside her. "What's in there?" he asked. "My books," she answered. "Step aside." She moved reluctantly. He yanked open the locker after she finished the code, rifling through binders and notebooks. He pulled out her calculus textbook, flipped it open, then tossed it back inside. "Clean enough," he muttered. "For now." Her friends began to notice, but their responses were complicated. Some avoided her altogether, afraid to be associated with someone under his scrutiny. Others whispered words of sympathy, but did nothing when he stopped her again. Fear was contagious, and Doyle wielded it like a weapon. The students learned the safest strategy was silence. Teachers pretended not to see. In the staff lounge, one of them mentioned in passing that Doyle seemed a little intense, but the assistant principal cut the conversation short. "He's here for everyone's safety. Best not to question." That was the end of it. No teacher intervened when he pulled her aside during transitions. No administrator asked why her name appeared more frequently in his reports. The system protected him, not her. For Dakota, the weight of those moments pressed harder each day. She found herself waking earlier in the mornings, her stomach knotted before she even reached the parking lot. The once bright halls of Ridgeview seemed darker, colder, their posters about respect and equality mocking her reality. Each time she saw Doyle's frame at the end of the corridor, her chest tightened. One afternoon after soccer practice, she walked alone toward the exit. The building was quiet, most students gone, the echo of her footsteps carrying down the empty hall. She turned a corner, and there he was, waiting. "You're here late," he said. "Practice ran over." "Show me your bag." She hesitated. "It's just cleats and clothes." "Open it." She unzipped it slowly, revealing the worn shoes, the sweat-soaked jersey. He poked at the items with one finger, then looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Nothing," she said flatly. "Careful with that tone," he replied, his voice low. He took a step closer, too close, forcing her back against the wall. "Respect is earned, and you're not earning any." Her heart pounded, but she held his gaze. For a moment it felt like a test, a game of endurance. She said nothing. After a long pause, he stepped back, adjusted his belt, and walked away. When she reached home that night, she slipped past her father quickly, claiming she was tired. In her room, she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her hands. They trembled slightly, betraying the fear she refused to show him. She thought about telling him, but the words caught in her throat. How could she admit that despite all her training, despite all the lessons in resilience, she felt powerless? Chuck Norris was not just her father. He was the image of strength itself, a man who could defeat enemies twice his size on screen and in life. How could she confess that she, his daughter, was being broken not by fists, but by the slow, grinding cruelty of a man in uniform? At school, the whispers grew. Students speculated about why Doyle targeted her. Some suggested it was because of her father, others that she must have provoked him somehow. Rumors swirled in chat groups and on lunch tables. She overheard a girl say, "She thinks she's better than us. Maybe that's why he's putting her in her place." The words stung, but she kept walking. She had learned long ago that explanations rarely mattered when people had already chosen their version of the truth. As weeks passed, the line between intimidation and violence blurred. One day during a passing period, Doyle grabbed her wrist roughly, claiming she was walking too fast and looked suspicious. His grip was iron, leaving a faint bruise she concealed under long sleeves. She swallowed her anger, but it lodged like a stone in her chest. At night she began sketching in her notebook, filling pages with abstract shapes, jagged lines that mirrored the tension inside her. It was her way of releasing what she could not speak aloud. In those quiet hours, she admitted to herself what she would never say in daylight. She was afraid. Fear did not come in the form of sudden terror, but as a constant hum beneath her skin. It lived in the corners of hallways, in the silence of her classmates, in the blind eyes of her teachers. It lived in the footsteps behind her, heavy and deliberate. It grew each day, feeding on her silence, waiting for the moment it would burst into something that could no longer be ignored. And though Dakota tried to carry it alone, to convince herself she could endure it as her father had taught, deep down she sensed that the storm building around her was too great to contain. The humiliation had already cut deep. The fear was beginning to carve its mark, and soon she knew Doyle would cross a line from which there was no return. The weeks of quiet torment stretched into months, and though Dakota's face remained calm, the storm inside her grew heavier. Every morning she walked through Ridgeview's doors, bracing herself for the possibility of another confrontation. Every afternoon she counted the hours until she could step outside again and breathe without the weight of Doyle's presence pressing down on her. Her friends had long since drifted away, some out of fear, others out of indifference. The teachers continued their blind routines. Even when she sat in class trying to focus on equations or historical dates, she could feel the officer's gaze lingering from the hall whenever he passed the open doorway. It was a gaze that carried both accusation and intent, as though he were only waiting for the right moment to escalate what had begun as intimidation. That moment arrived on a gray Thursday morning when the air was thick with rain, the windows streaked with drops that blurred the view of the outside world. The corridors were quieter than usual. Students moved sluggishly between periods, some hurrying to avoid the storm outside, others distracted by their phones. Dakota had just left her math class, her notebook tucked under her arm, when she realized the hall near her locker was unusually empty. Only the echo of her footsteps and the hum of fluorescent lights accompanied her. She turned the corner, and there he was, standing directly in front of her locker, arms crossed, waiting as if he had known her schedule down to the minute. "Where were you just now?" Doyle's voice cut through the silence. "In class," she answered, keeping her tone even. He took a step closer, blocking her way to the locker. "Funny, because a student just reported their phone missing, said it disappeared near here." She frowned, clutching her notebook tighter. "I don't know anything about that." "Of course you don't," he said, his words laced with sarcasm. "Empty your bag. It's just books. Do it." Her hands shook slightly as she unzipped the bag, revealing the textbooks, loose papers, and a pencil case. He rummaged through it, tossing the items onto the floor one by one, his movements careless and rough. When he found nothing, he leaned in so close she could smell the bitter stench of coffee on his breath. "You think you're too smart to get caught?" His eyes flicked over her face, reading her silence as defiance. "You think that last name protects you?" Dakota's chest tightened, but she said nothing. She wanted to scream, to shove him away, but her father's lessons whispered in her memory. Control first, act second. She held her ground. Her refusal to react seemed to ignite him. With a sudden movement, he grabbed her shoulder and slammed her back against the lockers. The metal reverberated with a hollow clang that echoed down the corridor. She gasped, pain shooting through her shoulder blade. Before she could recover, his fist pressed against her chest, pinning her in place. "Don't look at me like that," he snarled. "Show me your pockets." Her eyes widened, but no words came out. The silence that had once been her shield now betrayed her. He mistook it for guilt, for resistance. His teeth clenched, and in an instant he shoved her harder into the lockers. Two freshmen at the far end of the hallway froze, their laughter dying on their lips as they watched the scene unfold. One of them raised a phone hesitantly, the screen trembling in his hand. "You think you're better than everyone else," Doyle hissed. "Too good to speak? Too good to follow orders?" Still, Dakota said nothing. her throat locked tight with fear and defiance. That was when his rage snapped. He yanked her away from the lockers and threw her forward, then kicked her sharply in the abdomen. Her body folded with the impact, air rushing from her lungs. She staggered, and before she could straighten, his boot struck again, this time against her ribs, sending her crashing sideways into another row of lockers. The sound of her skull connecting with the metal rang out like a cruel drumbeat. She slid down to the floor, her notebook slipping from her grasp, pages scattering across the tiles. Blood trickled from her nose, staining her white shirt in a jagged red line. Her vision blurred, her breath shallow, her body refusing to obey her mind's desperate commands to move. The freshman gasped audibly, one clapping a hand over his mouth. Another student, just arriving from around the corner, froze in shock, then fumbled with her phone to record. The hall filled with the soft but unmistakable sound of a camera capturing every brutal second. Doyle towered over Dakota's crumpled frame, adjusting his belt as if he had accomplished a necessary task. Resisting, he muttered under his breath, the justification already rehearsed. His eyes flicked toward the students at the far end, and for a moment they thought he might come for them next. But he only glared, his face twisted with the satisfaction of power unchecked. The students remained frozen, torn between terror and disbelief. They had seen fights between classmates, arguments that escalated into shoves, but never this. Never an officer, a man hired to protect them, turning his body into a weapon against a girl who had done nothing more than stay silent. From a nearby classroom, a teacher stepped into the hall at the sound of the commotion. Her eyes landed on Dakota's bleeding figure, and Doyle looming above her. For a heartbeat she hesitated, her mouth opening as though to speak, but then she faltered. Without a word, she retreated into her classroom and shut the door. Dakota lay trembling, her hands weakly trying to push herself up, but her body refused. The tile was cold beneath her palms, her blood dripping onto the floor in tiny red spots. She could hear the faint murmurs of students, the gasp of someone whispering, "Oh my God!" But the rest of the world felt distant, muted. Doyle crouched beside her, his voice dropping low, venomous. "This is what happens when you think the rules don't apply to you." His words were meant to break her, to remind her that he was the wall, and she was nothing but a shadow pressed against it. As he stood again, ready to walk away and let the silence swallow the truth, the students' phones continued recording. The evidence of his brutality was no longer hidden. In less than an hour, those images would spread beyond the school walls, igniting a storm neither he nor the administrators could contain. For now, though, the hallway was filled only with the sound of her shallow breaths and the heavy thud of his boots retreating. Dakota's world dimmed at the edges as she fought to remain conscious, her heart pounding in her ears. She had endured his humiliations, his constant scrutiny, but this was different. This was violence unleashed, a line crossed that could never be redrawn. The silence of Ridgeview High had finally shattered, but in the most brutal way imaginable. And somewhere beyond those doors, her father was on his way, unaware that the storm he had taught her to withstand had just broken over her with merciless force. The fluorescent lights of Ridgeview's hallway flickered faintly above Dakota as she lay crumpled on the cold tile floor. The air tasted metallic in her mouth, her head throbbing from the brutal impact against the lockers. Blood dripped slowly down the side of her face, each drop splattering on her white shirt like crimson signatures of violence. The muffled gasps of students who dared to peek from the edges of the corridor swirled around her consciousness, faint and far away. The figure of Officer Doyle loomed just above her, his chest rising and falling with exertion, but more than that, with the false authority of a man who believed he had won. His shadow stretched over her like a dark shroud, and for a moment Dakota's world blurred to silence. At that same time, beyond the school doors, Chuck Norris was driving his black SUV into the parking lot. It had become his small routine to stop by the school when he wasn't caught up in work or appearances, not because his daughter needed him to, but because he enjoyed those quiet car rides home with her, where she talked about classes, teammates, and life in a way she rarely did at the dinner table. He pulled into a spot near the main entrance, glancing at his watch. Practice had run late yesterday, but today he expected to find her waiting near the lockers. He cut the engine and stepped out, the steady rain tapping softly against his shoulders. As soon as he entered the front doors, a faint tension prickled the back of his neck. Years of training in both combat and life had sharpened his instincts beyond simple awareness. The lobby looked normal at first. The front desk receptionist busy with a phone call, a couple of students passing by with hurried steps. But underneath, something was wrong. The atmosphere was tight, the kind of tightness that hangs in the air when people are afraid to breathe. Chuck walked further into the building, his boots echoing against the polished tile. He headed toward Dakota's usual hallway, and that was when he heard it, the hushed whispers, the distinct tremor of panic in young voices, the sound of a phone clattering against the ground. His pace quickened. When he turned the corner, the scene froze his blood. His daughter was slumped against the base of the lockers, blood dripping from her nose, her arms limp, her books scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. Her chest rose and fell shallowly, each breath labored, fragile. Above her, Doyle stood with his arms folded, the smug set of his jaw suggesting no regret, no hesitation. For one instant, time itself seemed to fracture. Chuck's mind processed everything, the bruises blooming along his daughter's face, the fear carved into the expressions of the students watching from the far end of the hall, the oppressive figure of the officer still standing in a position of power. "Dakota," Chuck breathed, his voice low, but his chest surged with a rage that had not burned in him for years. His eyes flicked back to Doyle, narrowing, hardening into steel. The officer turned, clearly startled to see a man like Chuck Norris standing there. He tried to mask his surprise with arrogance. "Sir, this doesn't concern you." She resisted. "I had to—" Chuck's voice cut through him like a blade. "That's my daughter." The weight of the words filled the corridor, sending a ripple through the crowd of silent students who peeked from behind lockers and classroom doors. Doyle shifted uncomfortably, his hand brushing against the baton at his side, as though to remind himself he still had authority. But the truth was already written across the scene, and the weight of Chuck Norris's presence was not something that could be brushed aside. Chuck stepped forward, his boots deliberate, his eyes never leaving Doyle's. He crouched beside Dakota for a brief moment, his hand hovering carefully over her shoulder, checking her breathing, her pulse. Relief flickered in his chest when he confirmed she was still conscious, though dazed. He brushed a strand of hair from her face gently, his jaw tightening at the sight of her bruises. Then he stood, and when he faced Doyle again, he was no longer just a father. He was the fighter, the soldier, the man forged by decades of discipline, precision, and the responsibility of knowing when to unleash his skill. Doyle raised his chin, masking his fear behind a growl. "Step back, old man. I was doing my job. She attacked me first." Chuck's voice was ice. "You put your hands in your boots on a child." He took another step closer, his broad frame closing the space between them. "On my child." The officer reached for his baton, swinging it upward in a clumsy attempt at intimidation. But the moment the weapon moved, Chuck reacted. His right hand shot forward, catching Doyle's wrist mid-swing with a grip like iron. Before the officer could even register what had happened, Chuck twisted sharply, redirecting the momentum. The baton clattered uselessly to the floor as Doyle gasped in pain. The hallway erupted with the sound of students stifling their astonished cries. Phones lifted higher, capturing every second of the confrontation. Doyle snarled, trying to recover, throwing his other hand into a punch toward Chuck's jaw. But the martial artist sidestepped effortlessly, his left forearm snapping up to block the strike. In one smooth motion, he countered with a precise strike to Doyle's midsection, forcing the air from his lungs. Doyle staggered, but he wasn't finished. His training as an officer was no match for the decades Chuck had spent mastering karate, judo, and countless disciplines. But adrenaline fueled his desperate swing. He lunged forward, aiming to tackle, but Chuck pivoted, his foot sweeping low in a clean arc. Doyle's legs were knocked from under him, and his body hit the tiles with a dull, humiliating thud. The officer scrambled up, wild fury in his eyes. He lunged again, aiming to drive Chuck back against the lockers, but the attempt was clumsy. Chuck caught him by the collar, spun him with practiced efficiency, and slammed him chest first into the row of lockers with enough force to rattle the metal doors. The resounding clang echoed down the hallway, louder than any bell that had ever rung in Ridgeview. Students gasped again, some whispering to one another, unable to believe what they were seeing. For them, Chuck Norris had always been a name in movies, a figure in memes, a legend spoken of with awe. But here he was, flesh and blood, protecting his daughter with a ferocity that needed no stage, no script. Doyle wheezed, still struggling, his pride refusing to accept defeat. He twisted, trying to elbow Chuck in the ribs. The move was met with a swift block, Chuck's arm snapping up to trap the strike. With a smooth pivot, he applied pressure to Doyle's elbow, forcing him down to one knee. Pain contorted the officer's face, his bravado collapsing beneath the inescapable truth of physical dominance. "Enough!" Chuck said, his voice deep and resonant, carrying across the hall like judgment. But Doyle spat defiantly, his voice strangled with pain. "You can't do this. I have authority here." Chuck leaned closer, his face calm but unyielding. "Authority doesn't give you the right to brutalize children. It doesn't give you the right to brutalize my daughter." With a final, controlled movement, Chuck released him, only to spin him around and slam his back against the lockers one last time. The officer sagged, his limbs weak, his breath ragged. The fight was gone from him, stripped away by precision, strength, injustice embodied in one man. Silence filled the corridor. Dozens of eyes watched from behind phones and lockers. For the first time in months, their fear shifted. It no longer clung to Doyle. It clung to the realization that power could be challenged, that someone could stand where they had been too afraid to stand. Chuck turned back toward Dakota. She was sitting up now, dazed but aware, her eyes meeting his. Tears welled at the corners, not from weakness, but from the flood of relief that came with seeing him there, unshakable, undeniable. He crouched beside her, gently supporting her shoulders. "I've got you," he whispered, his voice softer now. Behind them, Doyle slumped to the floor, beaten in every sense of the word. His chest heaved, his authority shattered before the very students he had sought to intimidate. The phones continued to record, and though Chuck did not care for fame or spectacle, he knew in that moment that the truth of what had happened could no longer be buried. The storm that had broken over Dakota had drawn her father into its center, and together their lives and the lives of everyone in that school were about to change forever. The echo of metal striking against metal still reverberated in the minds of those who had witnessed the confrontation. The image of Officer Doyle slumped against the lockers, his authority crushed not only by physical defeat, but by the eyes of dozens of students, spread through the school like wildfire before anyone even had time to process what had happened. The moment Chuck Norris helped Dakota to her feet, supporting her trembling frame with the gentlest of touches, phones in the hall were already uploading shaky, grainy clips to group chats. Within minutes, those clips leapt beyond the school walls. Dakota leaned against her father as he guided her toward the nurse's office. Her legs were unsteady, her vision still blurred, but she held her chin high, unwilling to let Doyle see any more weakness. The crowd of students parted like a tide as they passed, their phones raised high. Some whispered in awe, others in disbelief. For many, this was the first time they had seen power challenged inside these walls, and it was not the officer who stood victorious. By the time Chuck sat beside his daughter in the sterile brightness of the nurse's office, murmuring to her quietly while a shaken school nurse dabbed at the cuts on her face, the video was already climbing in views on social media. Hashtags formed like sparks catching flame. Justice for Dakota. Chuck Norris. Protect our kids. Some students who had never spoken to her before now posted furious captions alongside the video, demanding accountability, demanding to know how the school could have allowed such brutality. Back in the main office, Principal Stillwell received the first phone call before the hour was out. It was a local journalist asking for comment on the altercation between Officer Doyle and a student. Stillwell's face drained of color. "How did this get out so fast?" he muttered, staring at his secretary, who only shrugged helplessly. By the second call, this time from the superintendent's office, he realized the story was already bigger than him. Meanwhile, Doyle sat on a bench near the staff lounge, clutching his ribs and refusing to meet anyone's eyes. His uniform was disheveled, his breath still ragged. A couple of teachers walked past, pretending not to see him. The officer muttered under his breath, "She resisted. That's all this was. Procedure." But even he knew his words rang hollow. He had felt the shift in the air when Chuck arrived, when the students saw him beaten back with skill and precision. His control was broken, and no official report could erase the images spreading through every phone in the building. As the afternoon wore on, parents began arriving at the school. Some came to collect their children early, furious at the rumors they had heard. Others demanded meetings with administrators. One mother shouted in the front lobby, "My son was in that hallway. He saw everything. You let that man put his hands on a child?" Security tried to calm her, but her words struck deep. The polished facade of Ridgeview, the banners of respect and excellence, cracked with every accusation. At the hospital later that evening, where Dakota had been taken for x-rays and treatment, Chuck sat beside her bed, his hand resting over hers. She was quiet, her face pale but her spirit unbroken. She stared at the muted television mounted on the wall, where already the local evening news was replaying the viral video. The clip was grainy, the angle imperfect, but the story was undeniable. An officer slamming a teenage girl into lockers, a boot striking her ribs, her crumpled body on the floor. Then the turn Chuck's entrance, his decisive takedown of the officer, his defense of his daughter. The anchor's voice carried solemn weight. Tonight, questions swirl around Ridgeview High School as shocking footage shows a security officer violently attacking a student before being confronted by her father, martial arts legend Chuck Norris. Dakota shifted uncomfortably. "They're making it about you," she murmured. Chuck squeezed her hand. "They'll know the truth, sweetheart. They'll see what he did to you." But she only closed her eyes, exhaustion overtaking her. For all her father's reassurances, Dakota understood something deeper. People would argue, people would twist the story, because that was what systems did when they were threatened. And she was right. The very next morning, while the video continued to explode online, the Ridgeview administration released a carefully worded statement. "We regret the unfortunate incident involving Officer Doyle and one of our students. At this time, we are reviewing all facts and cooperating with local authorities. We remain committed to ensuring the safety of every child in our care." Chuck read the statement on his phone, his jaw tightening. It was hollow, deliberately vague, the kind of language designed to pacify without admitting fault. He set the phone down and looked at Dakota, who was still resting on the couch at home, her face swollen, her eyes heavy. Across town, the superintendent held an emergency meeting with the school board. The mood was grim. "We cannot let this spiral into a PR disaster," one board member insisted. "The officer claims she resisted. If we emphasize that narrative, maybe we can contain the fallout." Another member shook her head. "Have you seen the video? The whole country has seen it by now. There's no containing this." Stillwell, pale and sweating, sat silently, knowing that his future as principal was already hanging by a thread. Meanwhile, on social media, the story had already moved beyond Ridgeview. Commentators debated whether Doyle's actions were isolated or part of a larger pattern. Parents from other schools began sharing their own stories of officers using excessive force on students. A former teacher posted anonymously, claiming she had witnessed similar incidents covered up. The spark lit by the video was becoming a wildfire, consuming not just one school, but the very system that had protected men like Doyle for years. Late that evening, Dakota scrolled through her phone, despite her father's protests that she should rest. She saw her face plastered across feeds, headlines shouting her name. Some posts were filled with love and outrage, strangers calling her brave, others demanding justice. But scattered among them were comments dripping with suspicion and hate. She probably mouthed off, "Don't believe everything you see. She's just using her dad's fame." Her throat tightened and she put the phone down, staring at the ceiling. "It's all out there now," she whispered. Chuck sat beside her, his eyes steady, his voice low. "The truth can't be hidden anymore. That's what matters." But even as he said it, he knew the fight had only begun. The system would not collapse overnight. They would try to rewrite the story, to cast doubt, to protect themselves. Yet he also knew something else. His daughter's suffering was no longer in the shadows. It was in the light, undeniable, in front of the entire world. At Ridgeview, whispers filled the teacher's lounge the next day. "Do you think she provoked him?" one asked nervously. Another replied, "No, I saw the whole clip. He went too far." Yet both fell silent when the assistant principal walked in, her expression sharp. "No speculation. Do you understand? We stick to the official line. This was a disciplinary issue, nothing more." But the students knew better. In hushed conversations over lunch, in scribbled graffiti on bathroom stalls, in anonymous posts online, they told the real story. And for the first time, many of them felt a shift inside themselves, a crack in the silence that had always kept them subdued. The explosion of truth could not be undone. Doyle's violence was recorded, Chuck's intervention immortalized, Dakota's pain exposed to millions. The administrators might try to bury it, but the world was watching now. And deep within the storm of outrage and disbelief, Dakota herself began to feel something stirring. She had been humiliated, broken, nearly silenced, but now her story was no longer hers alone. It had become a spark for others, a fire that would burn until justice could no longer be ignored. The storm that had erupted after the video surfaced did not die down with time. If anything, the fire only grew, fed by each new story that came forward, each parent who demanded answers, each headline that carried Dakota's name across the country. The explosion of truth that had begun in one hallway of Ridgeview High had spilled into every home in the district and beyond. Chuck knew it the moment he opened his front door the following morning to find reporters on his lawn, cameras flashing, voices calling out for comment. He shielded Dakota from them as she stepped out cautiously, her face still bruised but her eyes resolute. The school could no longer pretend nothing had happened. Doyle was suspended within 24 hours, though the announcement framed it as administrative leave pending investigation. Parents knew better. They gathered outside the school holding signs that demanded justice, their voices echoing through the streets. Students joined them, some holding posters with Dakota's image, others chanting her name. What had once been a place of silence was now filled with noise, a noise that refused to be quieted. Inside the district office, the board met again, this time under pressure so great that even their practiced evasions faltered. One of them slammed a fist on the table. "We can't protect him anymore. Not with the whole country watching. If we try to cover this up, it'll bring us all down." Another board member muttered about lawsuits already being drafted by furious parents. The superintendent rubbed her temples, her voice weary. "We release him. We cooperate. We let him face the consequences." And so, for the first time in years, Doyle faced accountability. But the consequences stretched further than one man. Investigators poured into Ridgeview, combing through records, questioning teachers and students. Old complaints, long ignored, began to surface. Files that had been quietly buried under resolved or unsubstantiated labels were reopened. Parents who had once been told their children had exaggerated now found their stories validated by the sudden flood of attention. The truth spread like cracks in glass, impossible to mend. For Dakota, the days that followed were both a blur and a reckoning. She found herself at the center of a movement she had never asked for. Strangers wrote letters of support. Teachers whispered encouragement when no one else could hear. Her peers, once silent, now approached her with their own confessions. "He cornered me once too," one boy admitted, his voice trembling. "I didn't think anyone would believe me." A girl added softly, "They called me a liar when I tried to tell. But now they have to listen." Chuck watched it all unfold with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He had spent a lifetime fighting battles on screens and in tournaments. But this was a war of a different kind. This was a battle for his daughter's dignity, for the safety of children who had no one else to defend them. In private, when the reporters were gone and the house was quiet, he sat with Dakota at the kitchen table. She sketched silently in her notebook, her lines darker now, sharper, filled with shadows that spoke louder than words. "They see me as some symbol," she murmured one evening, not looking up. "But I didn't do anything except survive." Chuck placed a hand over hers, steady and warm. "Sometimes surviving is the bravest thing you can do. And sometimes that's enough to inspire others to speak." The lawsuits came next. Parents filed them against the district, against the principal, against Doyle himself. Civil rights attorneys stepped in, and soon the story reached the attention of national organizations. The American Civil Liberties Union issued a statement. Members of Congress referenced Ridgeview in debates about the role of officers in schools. What had begun as one girl's suffering had turned into a conversation about systemic abuse. Stillwell, the principal who had once hidden behind bureaucratic walls, resigned under pressure. His face appeared in newspapers with the words "failed leadership" attached to it. He tried to defend himself, insisting he had not known the extent of Doyle's actions, but few believed him. The public wanted change, and scapegoats would not be enough. The district promised reforms, though Chuck knew promises meant little without action. Through it all, Dakota's voice remained measured, steady. When a journalist asked her what she wanted most, she answered simply, "That no one else has to go through what I did." Her words were replayed countless times, her face appearing on screens across the nation. She did not shout. She did not call for vengeance. She spoke quietly, and her quiet strength resonated more than any outburst could. Chuck, too, found himself pulled into the spotlight. Interviews requested his perspective not as an actor or martial artist, but as a father who had defended his child when no one else would. He answered each question with the same steady calm he had shown his whole life. "This isn't about me," he said more than once. "This is about every child who deserves to feel safe in their school. If my daughter's story can help bring that safety, then that's the fight worth having." The school hired an interim principal, Dr. Lenora Hayes, a seasoned educator with a reputation for transparency. On her first day, she stood in the auditorium before students and staff. "What happened here is unacceptable," she said firmly, "but it will not define us. We will rebuild trust together, and it will start with listening to the voices that were silenced for too long." Some were skeptical, but others felt for the first time that change might truly be possible. In the months that followed, Chuck and Dakota turned their pain into purpose. Together, they founded an organization called Silent No More, dedicated to supporting families who had experienced abuse or harassment in schools. The nonprofit offered legal aid, counseling, and advocacy. Within its first 6 months, it had already helped dozens of families across several states. Parents who once thought they were alone now found allies. Students who had been silenced now had a place to speak. At home, life slowly regained rhythm, though scars remained. Dakota healed physically, but some nights she still woke from dreams of being slammed into the lockers, her chest tight with remembered fear. Chuck would sit by her side until she calmed, his presence steady as always. She never admitted it outright, but in those moments she knew her father's love had been her strongest shield. One bright spring afternoon, as the movement continued to grow, Chuck and Dakota returned to Ridgeview. The school was quieter now, its walls freshly painted, the hallways decorated with new posters about respect and dignity. But the memory of what had happened lingered in the air. Students stopped to watch as they walked together through the corridors, some whispering, some nodding in silent thanks. Dakota paused at the very spot where Doyle had struck her down. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cool metal of the lockers. For a long moment she stood there. Then she pulled a marker from her pocket and wrote a single word on the metal. "Listen." The letters were simple, but the meaning was clear. Students passing by stopped to read it, and within days the word appeared in other places across the school on notebooks, on posters, even whispered in the halls. It became a reminder, not just of what had happened, but of what had changed. Chuck placed a hand on her shoulder as they left the building together. "You've turned pain into strength," he said softly. Dakota looked up at him, her eyes steady. "We did." And so the legacy of that brutal day in the hallway became something greater than fear or silence. It became a call to action, a demand for justice, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, voices could rise and systems could be challenged. For Chuck Norris, it was the role of a lifetime, not on a movie set, but in the real world, standing where it mattered most. For Dakota, it was the beginning of a new path, not defined by her father's name, but by her own courage. Their story spread far and wide, inspiring countless others to stand up, to speak, to fight back against injustice. And though the wounds of that day would never fully fade, they had forged something lasting out of the pain, a movement, a message, and a legacy that would echo long after the echoes of Doyle's boots had vanished from Ridgeview's halls. If this story shook you, don't stop here. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next chapter. Watch our other videos right now for more unbelievable true stories that the system tried to bury. And share this video with your friends, because the more people see it, the louder the truth becomes.